My name is Marty Hayes. I'm the president of the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network, and our members are writing and asking us about mob and riot situations. This is being filmed July 2020, and of course we're having the civil unrest that we're seeing during this unique period of time in the United States of America. To answer these questions and more, not only for our members, but also for the general public, I've invited Mr. Massad Ayoob, the president of the Massad Ayoob Group, and an advisory board member of the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network. Mass is probably the foremost expert on use of force in self-defense. I've been working with him since 1990, and I'd just like to say thank you for sitting down with me today and discussing this very important, vital subject.
Thank you, Marty. It's a pleasure to be here. I think one reason we're getting so many questions on this topic is that there are so many facets to it and not so few really good answers.
Absolutely agree. It's a multi-variety or a varied topic. And because of that, why don't we start with a historical perspective of using force in self-defense in a riot or mob situation?
Sure. As long as we've been a country, and actually longer, it's been understood at law that when a violent mob attacks one or more innocent people, the mob is seen as a single amorphous entity with a shared intent and a shared malevolent purpose. Therefore, each member of the mob bears criminal and civil responsibility for what the mob does, and at the same time is vulnerable to the general jeopardy of an armed citizen's lawful response that was created by the fear generated by that mob. And when I say since before we were a country, go back to 1770, the Boston Massacre. You had a small group of British soldiers who were surrounded by an increasingly violent mob of American colonists. The colonists were armed with sticks, clubs, and were throwing rocks. The British had become sufficiently alarmed that their muskets were loaded and they had fixed bayonets. At one point, one of the soldiers fired, and then multiple shots were fired. 5 colonists were killed. The involved British soldiers were charged with murder. And when they were brought into court under, of course, they're British citizens under English law, they were defended by a man we now consider a great American, John Adams, who later became a president of the United States. He gave a ringing defense to the jury that made it clear that self-defense is really the highest of all human rights, that these people had been in danger with both, though I don't recall him using the phrase in his closing argument, what we know today as disparity of force, even among unarmed people. If something like, in this case, their force of numbers is so great that if the attack continues, the defender is likely to suffer death or great bodily harm, deadly force is warranted as a response. And a jury of American colonists found those British soldiers not guilty. Now, let's fast forward a little more than a century. In the 19th century, probably the most famous element of this today was the standoff in the Arizona territories when a man named Michael O'Rourke, who went by the name of Johnny by the Deuce and was something of a local thug, Johnny behind the Deuce, murdered a very popular mining engineer in a mining community. The other engineers, understandably, were furious about this, and they formed a lynch mob to take him away from the police and hang him in the streets. And the reason we remember it is because of some of the figures involved. He was defended by Wyatt Earp, his brother Virgil Earp, Ben Sippy, who was then the chief law enforcement officer for the town of Tombstone, and Johnny Behan, who was then the elected sheriff. And they stood there with shotguns, and they made it clear to the crowd, this man is innocent until proven guilty. We are going to bring him to trial, and he'll get a fair trial that he's entitled to. If you try to kidnap him from us, we'll shoot the first man who tries to cross our line, and the next, and the next. and that lawful intimidation had an appropriate effect. No one had to be shot that day. Let's fast forward some more into the 20th century. Probably the most famous armed citizen against a mob shooting occurred in Detroit, Michigan in 1925. An African-American physician named Ossian Sweet had moved into what was then an all-white, rather upscale neighborhood in the city of Detroit. It was a very segregated city, the law notwithstanding, and a very increasingly violent group of basically white racists had surrounded his home. He had a party of 10 other African-American people with him, most of them family. It accelerated, there were threats made by the surrounding mob, and finally they started throwing rocks through the windows at the people inside. Shots were fired from inside the house. One of the white rioters was killed and another shot and wounded. All of Dr. Sweet's party, 11 people total, were arrested for murder. They were tried together in their first trial, and the jury deadlocked. An all-white jury, by the way. By the second trial, the state had decided to prosecute the defendants individually, and the first to go to trial was Dr. Sweet's younger brother, Henry Sweet. The NAACP hired the greatest defense attorney of the time, Clarence Darrow, to defend him. And again, if you go back into history and you read the brilliant, heartfelt closing argument by Clarence Darrow about the right to self-defense, the principle of the Castle Doctrine, you'll understand why that all-white jury found Henry Sweet not guilty. And at that point, the prosecution knew where it was going and dismissed all the cases. Let's go to the late 20th century, where probably the most popular example of armed resistance to a violent riot occurred in 1992 in Los Angeles, the so-called Rodney King riots. Now, the rioting, the violence that grew from that, it was what triggered the riot was the acquittal of the 4 officers charged in the beating of Rodney King. What made Koreatown a particular focus was that within the same time frame, there had been a very controversial shooting there. A lady who owned a small market, a convenience store, in the neighborhood known as Koreatown, a Ms. Soon Ja-do, I believe. I'd have to look that up. I'm working from memory. Became involved in a fight with a 15-year-old African-American girl that she accused of shoplifting. The girl threw something in her face, and the Korean lady who owned the store responded by drawing a gun. A shot was fired, and Letitia Harkins was killed by a bullet to the back of the head. The shopkeeper was tried and convicted of voluntary manslaughter. But what, understandably, I think enraged the black community was that she was sentenced to probation with some community service and some fines. And all that was kerosene fuel, thrown onto the fire. The law enforcement community had withdrawn from Koreatown. And we'll discuss another day the law enforcement strategy at the beginning of that riot to hold back when the police officers themselves were ready to go in and quell it while it could be quelled. But the Koreans understandably perceived themselves as abandoned by the authorities and left to their own for self-defense. Thus was born the concept of the rooftop Koreans. The store owners and their employees brought rifles, shotguns, handguns, arrayed primarily on the roofs of the building. They gave them some cover and a vantage point, and made it clear, you start shooting at us, you start throwing Molotov cocktails through our windows and trying to burn our stores like you've been doing in the rest of the city, we'll shoot you. Now, that riot, as you know, lasted for days. The initial death toll was 56, and eventually rose to, I believe, 63, as some of the more seriously injured people succumbed. More than $1 billion worth of property damage, countless stores closed, and God knows how many thousands of people injured, some of whom would never be made whole. The interesting thing in the aftermath of the 63 dead, I can find no case of the investigation showing that they were shot by store owners protecting their lives and property. There are many anecdotal stories of that happening. We do know that in 2017, the Los Angeles Times did a follow-up study and determined that of those 63, 23 were unsolved. And it's believed that some of those were, in fact, rioters, looters, and arsonists who were killed by the defending store owners. Now, the rationale, remember, of deadly force against the mob was the presumption of shared criminal violent intent on the part of every member of the mob. Essentially, it was about lynch mobs. The reason we have difficulty with it today is what we're seeing filming here, doing this video here in mid-July of 2020, is a series of tumultuous outbreaks around the country that began with protesters who were concerned with what they perceived was police brutality against the African American community. But it quickly devolved into arson, property destruction, and extremely violent attacks on innocent people. I think the best explanation of the difference comes from a man I cannot name. He is a supervisor in a large metropolitan police department that has a long history of dealing with this sort of thing. And he makes the point that what we have today, we have to distinguish the rioters and the looters from the protesters. The well-intentioned protesters who in many cases have a permit from the city, a permit from the authorities to be marching, blocking city streets, or even in some cases blocking interstate highways in protest. He says the protesters are the sea in which the sharks are swimming. Those sharks being the looters, the rioters, those with a homicidal, destructive personal agenda. They are using the protesters as camouflage and as cover, almost the way Saddam Hussein used to surround his military facilities with encampments of innocent private citizens. So what we've got there is something entirely different, and that's why we're seeing a different complexion in the moods of the authorities in dealing with the use of deadly force in self-defense. We had the situation in a Pennsylvania city where the rioters broke into a gun shop, were confronted by the armed gun shop owner on video. They came in armed, and what Jeff Cooper would have called the head goblin wound up shot in the head and killed by the store owner with an AR-15. He fell, dropping the gun that he had in his hand that he had menaced the storekeeper with. That one from the get-go was clear, unquestioned self-defense. But then you had in another city the pawn shop owner who shot and killed a rioter. The rioter fell on the sidewalk outside the pawn shop. It remains at this filming unclear whether he was shot while outside or was shot inside and staggered outside. The store owner who shot him has been arrested for murder, and that remains to be adjudicated. We have cities where the police have been ordered out of the riot zones, and at that point, the citizen is literally helpless and literally on their own. But we're seeing that it's being treated somewhat differently. Now, we have also the possibility of you minding your own business, and let's say you took a wrong turn, found yourself in the midst of one of these tumultuous outbreaks, and people are rocking your car, trying to get into your car, trying to drag you out of the car. Plan A, of course, would have been to avoid it. When it comes to you, instead of you going to it, there have been cases of people driving out of it and not being arrested. There are also cases that have gone otherwise. The people who judge you are going to flash back to anything that looked similar on camera, and you can remember at any of these protest scenes, there's going to be a gazillion iPhones recording everything, and in the hands of people who have agendas and perhaps even the power to edit, upload to YouTube. In these situations, what I would be suggesting would be that you that you understand how the public is going to see it in context, the public being the jury pool for your trial, criminal or civil. They're going to flash back to 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, when a 20-year-old young man who had a history of advocating for white supremacy drove a Dodge Challenger at high speed into a crowd of people, severely injuring many, total injured I think were 19 or 20, and killing one of the young women that he struck. Now, his defense was that a block or more away, he had been surrounded by rioters. We thought we're going to drag him out of the car and stomp him into the ground like Reginald Denny was during the Los Angeles riots. So he fled in his car, and that's what he was doing when he unintentionally ramped into the crowd. The jury didn't buy it, and that young man today is convicted of murder and is serving a sentence of life plus 400 some years. A similar incident that I won't go further with because it hasn't yet been adjudicated occurred very recently in Seattle, Washington, in which a man drove his Jaguar at high speed into in a situation where a group of people had been allowed to block an interstate highway. He managed to get out of that road and run down two young women, one 24, I believe, and one 32. The video shows the bodies flying like 10 pins hit by a bowling ball. The 32-year-old was in critical condition, probably permanently injured, and the 24-year-old died of her injuries. He remains to be adjudicated. But that's what the prosecution and plaintiff's counsel are going to compare you to. If you put the pedal to the metal and put the wheels to the people surrounding you. So that's why we say it's more complicated than it looks. It's more complicated than the situation the law developed to handle.
Thank you, Mass, for that overview. Before we sat down today, we scoped out about 10 different specific scenarios. And please understand that what you're hearing here on this video is not legal advice. We're not telling you you can do this under these circumstances or you can't do this under other circumstances. What we can only do is try to give you a broad, general education about specific issues, and then you have to decide yourself how you want to handle it, because every case is going to be different. And so let's go ahead and just start running down some of these topics and see how that shakes out, okay?
Sure.
Okay, the first one is pretty simple. There's a murdering, killing mob attacking you. They're coming right at you. They're in your face. You know that they've killed other people. You perhaps have seen that. And what are the issues in responding to that incident?
I hope you have enough ammunition, and I hope you're a very good shot. One thing that we have seen in internet discussions and such is people saying, well, I'm going to put my 7.62 NATO defense rifle in the vehicle, and that way, by golly, if I load it with GI ball, if I'm attacked by a whole mess of rioters, I'll be able to, every bullet will go through the first two, and then at the third, and I'll get 3 for 1. And I've seen people suggesting hand-loading, deep-penetrating hunting bullets into handguns for the same thing. And that, in the situation that we have now, somebody in the crowd is killing people. We don't know how many of the people in that crowd are trying to hold them back. In the pattern that we've seen this year, there have been multiple cases where the rioters, the people throwing Molotov cocktails, the people setting patrol cars on fire, the people trying to drag passers-by out of cars, have been grabbed and dragged back and restrained by the protesters, while the protesters are saying, stop, that's not what we do, that's not us, you're making us look bad. All of them are strangers to you. Once you have an identified threat, you've got to be certain that your bullet does not miss and strike one of those bystanders who might be yelling, stop, let that person alone. That your bullet does not overpenetrate and pass through the only backstop you have, which is the body of your offender, the body of your assailant. If I perceive myself in a situation like that, lately I've been traveling. I normally carry a 124 grain plus B bonded low jacketed hollow point when I'm carrying a 9mm as I am today. I'm now keeping handy, for whatever gun I'm carrying in that caliber, a couple of magazines of 115 grain plus B plus. Penetration will generally be 10 inches in ordnance gelatin instead of 12 to 15 or 18 inches, but with a wide wound channel. It's much less likely to go through an intentionally targeted threat and strike an unseen bystander behind who was blocked from my view by darkness or perhaps just by the bulk of the assailant in my face himself or tunnel vision. I do make a point of carrying a double-stacked 9mm because if there are multiple targets, one simply needs multiple projectiles. Other things I'd suggest you have in mind with that. All of us, when we flash back to someone being attacked in a riot, go back to the man I mentioned a few minutes ago, Reginald Denny. In the early part of the Rodney King riots, he was a truck driver on his route, didn't realize what was happening, and found himself right in the middle. 4 men came out of the mob, tore him out of his car, stomped him into the ground. One of them picked up a cinder block and crushed his skull, leaving him permanently brain damaged for the rest of his life. When he was able to learn to speak coherently again after that injury, and ever since when he's discussed it, Mr. Denny has made a point. He said, everybody sees everything in black and white today, and they see the white man dragged out and stomped by 4 black men. What I remember is it was good black people who interceded, black people who saved my life, black people who took those attackers off me before they could kill me. The rescuers and the attackers are almost certainly going to be strangers to you. Once you're down on the ground and you just see all blurred faces who all look alike to you when your vision was blurred by a head injury, if you start shooting all of them, you may end up shooting the person who tried to rescue you. So be thinking in terms of targeting the assailant, making sure your bullet's not going to go through, make sure you're cool enough to hit what you're shooting at and not miss and strike an innocent bystander, and above all, to see the danger coming in time to use your weapon to stop it.
And that brings me to one point, in that in order to be that calm, cool, collected, you need some advanced training. The way to get to the point where you can handle a situation like this is to have handled situations like this in training, to train on multiple targets, to train on accuracy. Your CCW permit handgun class is not the type of training that most people would benefit from if they had to use that gun in self-defense in a mob situation. I would like to think that you could train yourself to the level of an advanced SWAT operator, and that frankly that's the type of person that is going to prevail in these types of situations the best. Okay, so that was probably the easiest one to talk about. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the other ones. Why don't we look at the violent and aggressive mob coming toward you on the street, but you don't know if they're a killing mob yet. You haven't seen any killing. They're just, they're dangerous, they're threatening. What about them?
Well, logic and tactics combine to tell you this is time for a strategic retreat. If at all possible, be gesturing with the international stop, I mean you, no harm gesture, shouting loudly, we've done nothing to harm you, leave me and my family alone, let us get out of here. If people are pointing at you and saying expletive deleted, you're going to die, certainly draw your gun if you're certain beyond to a preponderance of evidence standard, basically, more likely than not that you're in deadly danger. Draw the gun, and hopefully it will have the same deterrent effect as the guns of the rooftop Koreans.
Very good. Let's go ahead and take it one step back from that. Let's say that you see the mob, the riot scene out in front of you, but you don't know if there's any clear-cut violence involved with this. You haven't seen them assaulting anyone. You haven't seen them killing anyone. And they haven't immediately threatened you. Thoughts on how to handle that situation?
Drawing a gun would certainly be premature. You would be seen as what the law calls the initial aggressor, the person who began the escalation. Every member of the mob will be able to say, and some will sincerely believe it because they've misinterpreted the situation, that, hey, we were simply exercising our rights of free speech, and this crazy gun nut pulled a gun on us, and we were threatened. I felt I had to protect my friends and brothers and sisters, and that's why I lunged at him to disarm him before he could commit mass murder. So do not be the first to show hostile intent. If they're coming toward you and you just blundered into the situation, maybe it's simply a bunch of marchers who are chanting loudly, happen to be moving north when you are moving south. And this would be a very good time for you to move east, west, or north and get the hell out of there. Strategic withdrawal is not cowardice. Strategic withdrawal is strategic.
Okay, so let's say that we try to do that, but our movement is impeded by part of this mob. You see the mob coming down the street, and you turn to walk away, and damn, there's more people behind me. They're impeding your retreat. They're trying to stop you from leaving. Thoughts at that point?
Well, if they're stopping you from leaving, essentially those who restrain your movement unlawfully, and you have reason to perceive, violent or criminal intent, it's turning into kidnapping. It's turning into a false arrest, if you will, by private citizens. And at that point, I would demand, let me pass. I've done nothing to harm you. But at that point now, if we're hypothesizing there are two groups coming toward you, I would try to, instead of going head-to-head with either, attempt to find some other way out. If you are at that point blocked and hands physically on you, I hope you've learned firearms retention, and I hope you've learned how to shoot from retention. But you also must realize against 100 enraged people, you aren't going to have time to reload and fire 100 rounds, even if you had access to them. It's time to leave. The key thing to remember here, and one thing we've seen in other cases, if you go to be the hero, if you decide, well, they're going to raise their voices violently to assert their First Amendment rights, I have the same right to do mine. You are seen as a participant in mutual combat. And for centuries, it's been understood that mutual combat shreds the mantle of innocence. Mantle of innocence is the term the court uses to distinguish the innocent victim from the aggressor whose intent was to cause unlawful harm. Mutual combat, unless you are a licensed boxer by the State Boxing Commission and in the ring, is not legally sanctioned. And the mantle of innocence is called that because it's the cloak that shields you from criminal or civil liability if you have to act physically in self-defense. And you shred that protective mantle when you willingly go to something that you knew or should have known was likely to erupt in violence. Now, a good example of what I was just talking about occurred a few years ago in Seattle, Washington. A young conservative couple learned that a very controversial conservative speaker was going to appear and give a speech on a local campus. They knew that the left was very strongly protesting this, was going to be out in force, and had reason to expect a lot of the violent Antifa types were going to be present, which all turned out to be true. On social media, the husband had mentioned that he made it clear he understood that the college setting was a gun-free zone, so he would not be carrying a gun. But he said he'd be carrying pepper spray and words to the effect of he was prepared to crack some skulls in self-defense if that became necessary, and that his wife was going to carry a gun, which she did. As the situation evolved, my reading of it, from what I've seen and learned, is that the Antifas did in fact begin some violence, beginning with some pushing and shoving. The husband attempted to help some people he saw and perceived to be getting pushed around, and wound up pepper spraying a few people. One very large, buff Antifa guy came at him, and the wife was certain she saw a knife in his hand. At that point, she drew a Glock 26 and shot the Antifa guy down. She and her husband fled the scene. which complicated things later with the whole flight equals guilt element that we've discussed elsewhere in ACLDN training, and later turned themselves in. They were both criminally charged. The jury ended up deadlocked, and the prosecution decided, you know what, we're in such a politically controversial case, we may never get 12 people who are on the same side of this. We give up. A lot of observers said, oh, well, they didn't go to jail, so it's all okay. You talk to them about all okay. It was a 5-week trial with very good lawyers who don't come cheap, and their reputations have been smeared forever. The lesson from that is, if you anticipate there's going to be protests that may devolve into violence, don't be a fool. The best advice on that doesn't come from me or Marty or anyone in our business. It comes from the poet and humorist Ogden Nash. He said, when called by a panther, don't answer.
We just talked about you being on the street and being faced with a mob. What if you're on the street but you have your motor vehicle surrounding you? And we've seen instances where people drive through the mob. We talked about one earlier. Do you have any recommendations on how a person can best handle that situation?
First, drive slowly. Second, remember you have emergency gear for a reason. If you're going to have to do that, shout a warning, crack the window enough you can be heard, and shout a warning. Turn on your emergency flashers. Lay on the horn. Both of those things are standard warnings that say, get out of the way. Danger, danger. Be careful. Proceed slowly. Okay, don't back up and then with a running start crash through the crowd. That's guaranteed to cause death or great bodily harm. We saw the recent case of a man who did very slowly drive through, pushed a couple of people out of the way, at least one of whom fell, and one of the protesters in the crowd pulled a gun, opened fire, and shot the guy in the arm or shoulder. That one remains to be adjudicated. But remember, the other side is, human nature being what it is, we protect those we identify with. And you're harming any member of the crowd may pour fuel on the fire that makes the attack on you worse. If I saw someone coming toward my car with an upraised axe, one thing the Antifas are using are the window breaking tools used by police and paramedics for rescue. It's pretty clear they're not coming to rescue me. And at that point, it's going to be a decision whether I go to the gun or whether I attempt to drive away. The attempting to drive away is seen as will be seen as a lower level of force, particularly when you have the power to literally project death from your vehicle if you wanted to kill somebody. But emergency flashers, lay on the horn, and reasonable speed. Bear in mind also, the faster you're moving, the more likely that if you do collide with someone, it's going to trigger two things in a modern vehicle. It'll start your airbag, which is going to pin you in place and immobile for a short period of time, and it will generally shut off the engine. And now you are trapped with a whole lot of people you've just made a whole lot angrier. It would be worth your time to contact the manufacturers of your vehicle and find out just what speed it is that the airbags are set to trigger and the engine is set to shut off. Some of the modern smart cars may also automatically brake if you attempt to reverse or even go forward with a human being in front of you. Now, as an officer survival instructor for decades, I've counseled cops. Keep shooting glasses with you in the car and have them on anytime you're driving. Somebody throws a full beer can into the windshield, a rock hits the windshield hard enough, dropped from an overpass, or a bullet goes through that windshield, or simply in a car crash. As the safety glass shatters, you're going to get a spray of fine, high-speed particles right in your face. One of those officers thanked me later. He got in a high-speed pursuit of some heavily armed bank robbers. One of them started firing at his patrol car with a .45. Several bullets went through the windshield, and the bullets didn't hit him. But after the pursuit was successfully resolved, he realized he was bleeding, and his whole face in a pattern like this had been peppered with those fast, fine pieces of glass going in a 90-mile to 100-mile-an-hour pursuit. When he took off the glasses that had shielded his eyes, they were almost fogged with all those little impacts. That's why even in my private cars, I keep enough safety glasses for any passenger. And even though, thanks to cataract surgery, I can now drive without corrected vision, I still always drive with glasses on. And Marty, I know you have something on point to that too.
Yeah, I've been blessed with good vision, never had to use glasses my whole life. But in fact, probably due to your teachings back in the 90s, when I was on patrol, I started having a set of yellow driving glasses up in my visor of the patrol car. That way, whenever I got into any type of high-speed pursuit or running code to a call, I just slipped those on just in case something happened. A deer jumped in front of the car as I was doing 95 miles an hour, or somebody attacked the car, then my eyes were protected. So thank you for that.
Well, one other thing to remember, if it becomes necessary for you to fire from inside the car as attackers are coming at you with guns or other weapons and your vehicle is immobilized, bear in mind that when those of us who shoot up cars for tactical training purposes can tell you, when you shoot in a glass going from the outside in or from the inside out, some of that comes back at you from your own gunfire. It's another thing you have to be prepared for. It's another reason to have the safety glasses. And because cops are taught now, if you're under attack from the front, there's no time to do anything else to shoot through the windshield at their attacker. The officers I've talked to who've had to do that have all experienced some degree of permanent hearing loss. Without hearing protection, you know how loud those guns are. You can imagine how destructive it is when that sound is reverberating inside a small enclosed space, most particularly if you use a high-powered weapon. For that reason, being a shooter, we all keep stuff in our car that we're likely to use for our hobby. You know, people who play softball after work have ball and bat and glove. I generally keep active hearing protectors in all my cars. I would, if I was in the situation Marty postulated, surrounded, trapped in the car, and now believing myself to be facing deadly force, I would pick up those earmuffs and put them on. Now, the other side will say, ooh, you premeditated the murder. No, sir, I saw the danger coming. I knew what was going to happen. I prepared myself for it. And, sir, I figured somebody pointing a gun at you might be bluffing. Somebody pointing a gun at you with earmuffs on is probably not bluffing with his warning that he will fire if necessary, and hopefully would be more likely to intimidate the people unlawfully attacking me. I'd also suggest, just for traffic purposes and accident prevention and prevention of unmeritorious lawsuits arising from automobile accidents, be like some other countries where the dash cam isn't just standard equipment for the police, it's standard equipment for motorists. Along with that, if you have a GoPro camera for when you go water skiing, when the family goes to the beach, or when you go shooting or playing tennis, just to analyze your own skills, you've got to keep that GoPro someplace. Why not keep it in the car that you're going to drive to the tennis match, the shooting match, the beach, wherever? And if an emergency arises, put it on. You will have a visual record of what you saw, what you perceived, what it was that caused you to use deadly force in self-defense.
Okay, well, since we're on the topic of equipment in the cars, what about car guns here? AR-15 or your Riot shotgun. Should you have those available for you?
Well, Marty, if the day ever comes that Walking Dead ceases to be a television fantasy and becomes a documentary, I probably will. Until then, you've got to understand the problems that come with that. First, there are a great many states where it is not legal to have a loaded long gun in your car. They'll give you a permit to carry a concealed handgun. But I know of at least one state with the state fish and game laws. prevent you from keeping a loaded rifle or shotgun in your car because it's seen as presumptive evidence of intent to poach game out of season.
And that's the way it is in Washington State, too.
And in New Hampshire, my former stomping grounds. Now, the other problem you've got with it is you've got to, if the crap hits the fan and your vehicle is surrounded, you've got a choice. You can start wielding that shotgun and trying to hopefully scare people with it, or you can leave on foot and you've left the gun in the car. We've already seen what happens with that. Do a YouTube search for the rioters pulling a police AR-15 out of a patrol car that had been set on fire and abandoned, managed to apparently get it out of its restraining lock, and thank God a gun-savvy, streetwise security guard disarmed him. And I'm told that has happened more than once. Looters who are burning cars, destroying cars, are probably going to take a minute to go through the car first and think, hey, is there anything really cool I can steal? Oh, look, what's this? I learned to use one of these on Call of Duty, and now I'll be the alpha rioter. And we've caused more problems than we were going to solve. I prefer to stay with something that I can keep concealed on my person. An AR pistol with or without the shoulder brace is very difficult to conceal, as is the shockwave type shotgun. We've had the discussion earlier about in a situation where it may simply be a crowd surging forward in a certain direction, and only one or more of those people are the ones attacking you. You're going to need to shoot with surgical precision, and buckshot normally does not allow for that. So I would say the shotgun was out. Anything that's likely to shoot through a human being, which is darn near any load you can put in a 7.62 by 39 or 7.62 NATO. For those reasons, again, I would say would be out of the picture. If I was going to use a carbine, it would be a 223, but we've discussed the downside of it. If you're the only person wielding what the media has spent generations now convincing the public, read your jury pool, is an evil assault weapon whose mere possession is, some sort of malicious intent, you know where that's going to go. I would much rather have the pistol that I can keep concealed until I need it, conceal after I've needed it, and those of us who teach weapon retention agree the long gun is much easier for attackers to take away from the legitimate defender than the handgun for simple reasons of leverage and design. And that is particularly true of the L-shaped configuration of the typical AR-15, which does not allow the wrist to bend and flow in a struggle to maintain the weapon. So for me personally, my choice is no long guns unless they happen to be in the car for some other purpose. When the situation went down by surprise.
Yeah, and I think another issue is how secure is that gun in your car? I would never dream of leaving a rifle or shotgun if I lived in downtown Seattle and I had to worry about my car broken into. Where I live out in rural Lewis County, Washington, it's probably not as big a concern. And as long as my vehicle locked up well, then I might leave a loaded gun there. But that loaded rifle or shotgun would only be used if I was broken down late at night and I saw trouble coming from a ways away. Maybe then I would access that long gun. Okay, there's another question that members have been asking, and that is about use of force against the mob who is either attacking your home, trying to get in, or just simply outside your home and is acting like a threat to you, but maybe there's not any overt threats being made. What are your thoughts on those two scenarios?
Well, I'd say if there's no overt threat, you don't have reason to threateningly display a firearm, or display a firearm I would say in a way that your worst enemy could credibly construe was threatening. You might want to open your door with a gun well within reach, but certainly not pointed at anyone. And in my case, I might not even have it visible unless it was a holstered pistol. If I felt a need for a long gun, I'd want to have it slung. Do not point the gun. In one of the recent protest situations in a major city, a couple came out of their palatial home one with a pistol, one with an AR-15, were on video from the crowd, and essentially it was seen by the left as, oh my God, the rich land barons are threatening to kill us poor peasants. We told you this would happen. And it's seen by others as, way to go, you're protecting your property against 100-to-1 odds by a potentially violent group. Good for you. Well, in that particular city, Marty and I will tell you in our classes, you need to know the mood of the courts locally, which often is the mood of the prosecutors.
Yeah.
The prosecutor in that particular city only prosecutes about 23% of the cases presented to her by the police, from what we've heard, and supposedly received tens of thousands of dollars for her election campaign from George Soros. So a whole lot of the guns have already been confiscated based on a search and seizure warrant. And at this time, we are, again, mid-July 2020, we are expecting probably an arrest for aggravated assault and very probably an offer of indictment on an offer of information. I'd be surprised if she sent it to a grand jury. Now, what we've seen thus far was the videos of the protesters saying, oh my God, they've got guns. It's my understanding some of the crowd had guns too. And certainly you had the disparity of force element. The smallest estimate of the size of that crowd was 100. Now, they were chanting, but what we don't have yet, I hope it exists, but it hasn't been made public at the time of this discussion, is a view from the homeowner's perspective. Security cam, again, the GoPro camera, someone else running a camera for you. So you can show the triers of the facts later. This is what we faced. This is what the threat looked like from our perspective, and this is what the threat sounded like from our perspective. The people who stood on their lawn and stepped out of their house and told people, move along, leave, this is private property, say that the crowd was yelling threats to kill them, kill their dog, and burn down their home. Hopefully that can be documented. Critical thing will be whether those threats were made before or after they appeared with the firearms. The verbal threats certainly go far toward justifying their actions. The prosecution or plaintiff's counsel in a lawsuit can be expected to allege that, no, those threats only came from people in anger generated by the fear created by the initial aggressor couple. Critical for you to keep muzzle discipline if you ever do have to display your gun, and not let the muzzle cross people you are not yet directly threatened by. If you're not directly threatened, do not threaten deadly force. You won't be justified in using it. Don't threaten anything that you can't carry through.
Mass, I have one more question for you before we wrap this up. We've had several members talk about examples of where people have grabbed the AR-15s or their shotguns or even their pistols in an open carry holster, and they went down in mass and helped protect their downtown from being damaged, looted, vandalized when these riot situations first started. I don't see that happening much now. But what are your concerns there? What are the issues if a person decides to join that type of situation?
Well, first, in my heart, I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with them and proud of them for having the courage to stand up and do that for their community. I also have to warn them that the community may not be as appreciative as they'd hoped. If things go downhill, someone gets shot or killed at their hands, and the lawsuits start flying, and we start seeing unmeritorious prosecutions. A lot of it's going to depend where you are. One southern sheriff, God bless him, has come out publicly and said, look, you're welcome to protest here. You're welcome to march here. You come here and start violence and looting and arson, I will deputize every gun owner in my county to come forward and fight you. And if that's the case, and you've been deputized, hopefully the county will indemnify you. It'll be interesting to check the case law on that. if you are in the kind of community we were mentioning earlier, where the district attorney panders to people who are in the streets yelling, no justice, no peace, in which the operative term is no peace, not so much. You can't expect sympathy, and you may well become the centerpiece in a political show trial to guarantee that prosecutor's next election. And I don't think it's right. I don't like it any more than you do. But it's a whole lot better finding out from us now than from that district attorney later.
I mean, the network was formed to help armed citizens who are being wrongfully prosecuted or sued after a legitimate act of self-defense. And I've told several of our members that no, we're not likely going to open up the bank account and pay for your civil or your criminal defense if you went to the riot. If you went ahead and said, I'm going to insert myself into this violent situation. I'm sorry, that's not what the network is formed for, and we're probably not going to be there to help. On the other hand, if they come to your house and you're defending the mob, or you're defending your home from the mob, and they're trying to get in, then of course we'd be there for that person.
Good to hear.
I think that pretty much wraps up this. I would like to just take a couple minutes and talk about the network. Some people seeing this might be a little bit confused as far as what we are. The Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network is a membership organization started in 2008, and since then we have grown to over 18,000 members. We take a certain portion of our members' dues and set it aside in a legal defense fund, and we use that legal defense fund to help our members after an act of self-defense. As of this filming again, July 2020, that fund is over $2.5 million. And it just keeps growing every month. We just keep going up and up and up. And we've used that fund actually 25 different times to assist our members after an act of self-defense. We're not an insurance company. We don't have an insurance component. If you use force in self-defense and you call the network asking for some assistance with your legal fees, we're going to want to know some of the particulars to make sure that we're not helping a criminal get off on a criminal charge. We want to make sure there was in fact a legitimate act of self-defense. But after we clear that hurdle, then yeah, we're going to be there for you to help you with that unmeritorious prosecution or that civil suit, or typically, as we've done in most of the cases, just give some money to help pay for an attorney to represent you when the prosecutor is asking you questions, when the police are investigating, if and when it goes in front of a grand jury to help prepare you for that. And that's what the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network does. We would welcome interest, and we would welcome you contacting us at www.armedcitizensnetwork.org. I suspect that'll flash up on the screen, and take a look at what we have to offer. You've been an advisory board member since we started 2008. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've seen it in action. We have people like Dennis Tuller on the staff, who created the Tuller concept of speed of closure with hand-to-hand or contact weapons. Tom Gibbons, one of the all-time great instructors. John Farnham, who's actually been teaching private sector longer than either of us, and is an ex-combat Marine, Vietnam years. We have Jim Fleming, the famous criminal defense lawyer from Minneapolis. And basically, we've got a pretty good think tank to advise your attorney and available to advise them on this strategy, where to find the best expert witness for this, that, or the other thing.
And speaking of expert witnesses, we also have Manny Kappelson,
Yes,
who is one of the most sought-after
that.
expert witnesses in the country on use of force issues.
And an attorney himself.
Right. So that's who the Armed Citizens Network is. We're not the answer to everybody. We're not going to be able to pay off a lawsuit if it goes against you. We're not even going to negotiate a settlement. We're there to help you after a legitimate act of self-defense, voluntary, purposeful act where you used force to defend yourself or one of your loved ones.